everyone. So I chose to focus for my final paper on Rigoberta Menchu, who we briefly talked about in class when we spoke about Guatemala and its 36 year civil war from 1960 to 1996. I chose to focus on the impact that she had on indigenous rights in Guatemala and how her autobiography in 1982 eventually led international attention, which helped finally end the internal conflict in 1996. But also, I chose to talk about the controversy that surrounds the autobiography and how it affected the perception of Rigoberta Menchu in the public eye. Initially, what drew me to the topic was obviously I have family in Guatemala, as I've spoken about, and I find learning more about Guatemala really interesting because it's learning about my roots, even though my family is what indigenous people of Guatemala would call the Ladinos, basically European Guatemalans. I've obviously visited Guatemala and seen the overwhelming population of indigenous people that definitely feel like a majority in certain parts of where I've traveled to in Guatemala. I found Rigoberta Menchu fascinating when we spoke about her and read her excerpt, and when her book was passed around. I immediately wanted to read more, and so that's what I did. I thought it was amazing that this Mayan woman who came from poverty, was incredibly brave, was a part of the resistance against the corrupt military regime, and ended up eventually winning the Nobel Peace Prize in 1992. It boggled my mind that actually is a true thing that happened. The story seemed almost too good to be true. So when, during conference, Professor Rodriguez spoke about the controversy that surrounds it, I immediately, again, was intrigued and wanted to know more. And for those of you who don't know about the controversy, essentially an anthropologist named David Stoll in the 90s tried to claim that Rigoberta Menchu was lying or exaggerated a lot or some parts of her autobiography in efforts to get people to join the guerrilla movement and portray the militant regime as the bad guys, which, I mean, partly, yeah, they were. So David Stoll wanted people to stop romanticizing the guerrilla movement, and that was his intent on writing this book, but it basically made Rigoberta Menchu look really bad and made the autobiography, it kind of discredited her as a witness to the awful atrocities, which was obviously a shame because she did live through a lot, and her story is representative of so many other people's stories in Guatemala. One of the quotes that she says, the very first sentence, I believe, that is in her book is, let me see if I can find it. It is, "The important thing is that what has happened to me has happened to many other people too. My story is the story of all poor Guatemalans. My personal experience is the reality of a whole people." So right then and there, she comes out with it, and that was something that David Stoll tried to refute in his book, and tried to disprove, I guess. So my topic links to a variety of themes discussed in class. We obviously talked about the atrocious civil war that Guatemala went through, lasted 36 years from 1960 to 1996, and how so many people in the time period were killed and disappeared, and a lot of indigenous people were affected primarily. So a lot of people refer to points in this time period in Guatemala as genocide. We talked about how different Guatemala is because of the high indigenous population and how that sets it apart from other countries in Latin America. And essentially what I argued in my paper was that regardless of the controversy, Rigoberta Menchu served as a symbol of to bring international attention to the issues that Guatemalans were facing, and this ultimately led to the peace agreement in 1996. And a piece of evidence for that, like how important she was to this movement, to the peace movement, was that she was there. She was actually one of the people present when they signed this peace agreement. So obviously, this is a huge tell that she made a big contribution to ending the Guatemalan Civil War. Who knows how long it would have lasted had there not been more outside pressure to end this war. While there might have been some propaganda elements to the autobiography, ultimately it's an important work of Guatemalan history. Menchu came to symbolize indigenous struggles under a dictatorship that committed what some say is one of the worst genocides of the century in Latin America. And she did so by introducing people to the Mayan culture and their suffering under this regime. So one of the quotes that I wanted to share with you all was a quote from Rigoberta Menchu, which is her autobiography in 1982. So she says of her parents, "They told me I would have many ambitions, but I wouldn't have the opportunity to realize them. They said my life wouldn't change. It would go on the same: work, poverty, suffering." So this just shows the cycle and how difficult it is as an indigenous person in Guatemala to rise above, which is amazing to see her story and really think about how much she's managed to rise above, coming from a poverty-ridden place. So, in the 3 years leading up to the publication of Rigoberta Menchu from 1981 to 1983, the Guatemalan army destroyed 626 villages, killed or disappeared more than 200,000 people, and displaced an additional 1.5 million. So these are just some of the examples of how awful this civil war was and how much suffering went on. So when Rigoberta Menchu shed light on these issues, a lot of people were shell-shocked. So I go into a little bit more about the controversy surrounding it, and from an intellectual standpoint, obviously, when David Stoll found out that some or not all things in the book weren't necessarily all true, from an intellectual standpoint, it was difficult to stand by and not say something, but also from an ethical standpoint, this book has served as a really important part of Guatemalan history and has actually helped people. So there's definitely arguments as to whether or not he should have went on with his research. He actually came out and said in one of the books about the controversy, singularly just about the controversy and people's opinions about it, he said in an interview that I've never said that her testimonial is a lie or a fraud. In fact, one can argue that it was good that Rigoberta told this story in 1982 because it attracted the world's attention to the crimes committed by the Guatemalan army and in the end contributed to the signing of the peace agreement. So he himself, those words came out of his mouth. He himself says so, that she directly contributed to the signing of the peace agreement that finally did the violence and the human rights violations and the atrocities that were going on in this 36-year civil war, this internal conflict. So due to her dedicated actions and this compelling narrative that she constructed in Rigoberta Menchu, Rigoberta Menchu came to be a political activist and is now synonymous with bravery and resistance, which is quite the story. So yeah, that's a little bit about my paper and how it's linked to an array of themes that we've covered throughout this semester. So thanks for listening. I appreciate it. Thank you so much.